What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our starts and sits at the running back position for week 4 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you're new to the channel, we put out free daily fantasy football content, and drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I will get back to you as soon as I can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, Thursday night football, we've got the Dolphins at the Bengals. I think it's okay to flex the Dolphins running backs, but gosh, are we just up and down with his backfield. In week 2, Raheem Mostert had 10.9 fantasy points. And week 3 versus Buffalo, he had 1.1. And week 2, Chase Edmonds had 5.1 fantasy points. In week 3 versus Buffalo, he had 15.7 fantasy points, 2 scores on the day. So I think if you don't have better options, it's okay to take a gamble with the Dolphins running backs. But gosh, they're really not my favorite overall just because of the inconsistency that we've seen. But like I said, if you don't have better options, I think it's okay. But can I guarantee either of these running backs is going to get you double-digit fantasy points? No, I can't. They are just way too all over the place. But as long as Tua is healthy going into Thursday, this Dolphins offense looks pretty good. So, like I said, you could take the gamble. It's not my favorite, though. All right, Joe Mixon, on the other hand, was a dud in week 3 at 6.8 fantasy points, 12 rushing attempts, 24 rushing yards, 7 targets, which is nice, but just 3 receptions, 14 receiving yards. That was after 21.5 fantasy points in week 1 and 11.3 in week 2. He came out to just 6.8 fantasy points in week 3. Listen, Miami's defense is pretty darn good, but I like Joe Mixon. You guys know I love Joe Mixon. If you guys are new to the channel, hey, I love Joe Mixon. So he's still a start for me heading into Thursday night football. All right, moving into Sunday's action, our 1 o'clock games. We've got the Vikings at Saints, and I take that back. This is not a 1 o'clock game. This is a London game. So the consensus at the moment, although Dalvin Cook exited week 3's matchup versus Detroit with a shoulder injury, the consensus is that he's going to be okay to play versus New Orleans in London. He's going to wear a shoulder brace and be able to soup up. So doesn't look like Alexander Madison's going to be a huge thing going into week 4, but still a handcuff running back absolutely worth rostering. Cook had a pretty good week versus Detroit at 12.6 fantasy points, 96 rushing yards, and a score. So yeah, I still like Dalvin Cook, and obviously if you drafted Cook, he's probably a starter in your lineup as long as he's healthy. I'm not too worried about re-injury overall because we saw a shoulder injury last year, Dalvin Cook, and he played through it. But like I said, Alexander Madison absolutely worth holding on to on your bench just in case. All right, Alvin Kamara, very disappointing fantasy season thus far, sitting at RB 54 in full PPR. 7.6 points in week 1, did not play in week 2, 6.3 points in week 3. He did total 73 yards. If he found the end zone, we'd probably be having a different story, but he did not find the end zone, and he did have a lost fumble. So at the moment, I'm looking at Kamara as a pure flex. If you have better options at the RB1 or RB2 spot, you guys are probably hurting if you've been starting Kamara on the season so far. So I think he's worth moving into the flex. But hey, we all know what he's capable of, so don't bench him quite yet. But he has been kind of downgraded, in my opinion, to a flex moving into week 4. All right, Seahawks at Lions. I'm sitting the Seahawks running backs. Rashad Penny at 7.9 points against Atlanta. In week 3, Kenneth Walker had 6.3 points. So Walker had 3 rushing attempts, 3 targets, 3 receptions. Penny had 14 rushing attempts, 1 target, 1 reception. I just want nothing to do with this backfield whatsoever. There's no reason whatsoever in my mind to start Penny or Walker. Let's move right along. DeAndre Swift, listed as questionable at the moment. I've got him as a start if he plays, but when I made these slides for today's video, did not have the update from Dan Campbell, who is now saying DeAndre Swift could miss some time. He can miss weeks 4 and week 5, then rest up on the bye week in week 6 and return to action in week 7 versus Dallas. So it's big news, and it definitely makes Jamaal Williams more than a flex as I have him listed. So if this truly happens, obviously you're not starting Swift. He's going to be missing time. And obviously that makes Jamaal Williams an absolute start versus Seattle in week 4. But even if Swift does play in week 4, I still think at this point Jamaal Williams is a solid flex. We've seen enough of a pattern emerge in week 1, 2 touchdowns, in week 3, 2 touchdowns for Jamaal Williams, and he is thriving when he is in the football game. It's worth noting that Craig Reynolds is a solid backup running back as well for the Lions, but hey, this is, you know, kind of what we expected potentially out of Swift on the season. He just misses time, and when he does not miss time, he's an absolute baller, but when he misses time, you want a piece of that Lions backfield, and it's been proven they're going to be running the football quite a bit. So Jamaal Williams, probably in my mind your starter moving into week 4, but let's just finish this with whoever is starting for the Lions at the running back position in week 4 should be in your lineups. All right, Jets at Steelers. I've got both Jets running backs as flexes. I'm not quite ready to move them up into an RB1 or RB2 spot, but I do think they're both viable fantasy options moving into week 4. Breece Hall had 15.2 fantasy points in week 3 versus Cincinnati, 8 rushing attempts, 39 rushing yards, 11 targets, 6 receptions, 53 receiving yards. No scores, but he definitely got it done overall. Michael Carter, on the other hand, in week 3, 5.6 fantasy points, 11 rushing attempts, 2 targets, 1 reception. So the better fantasy day goes to Breece Hall. This is the main reason I have these running backs as a flex, because they're going to be very inconsistent. They're eating into each other's touches. I don't know if we're going to see Breece Hall emerge as the solidified starter until a couple more weeks pass, but I still think it has the potential to happen. But in the meantime, Michael Carter is still an option. It's just up and down with these two running backs, so they're flexes for me moving in to week 4. Najee Harris, on the other hand, is still a start for me, guys. I'm not panicking about Najee. In full PPR, he's had double-digit fantasy points every game on the season. The ceiling is capped. This offense is definitely capping Najee's ceiling overall, but he is talented enough to be a starter for your fantasy rosters. 10.6 points in week 1, 13.9 in week 2, 12.1 in week 3. Week 3 was a pretty good week overall for Najee. 56 rushing yards, a touchdown, 3 targets, 3 receptions. He gets the Jets in week 4. It's a good enough matchup. I think you continue to roll with Najee Harris in your starting lineups moving into week 4. All right, Bears at Giants. I've got both David Montgomery and or Khalil Herbert as flexes moving into week 4. We know that Montgomery exited week 3's matchup versus Houston, but at the moment he is considered day to day per the head coach of the Bears. So I think we have to keep an eye on things, obviously, right? Khalil Herbert had a monster week in week 3 in relief of David Montgomery. 20 rushing attempts, 157 rushing yards, and 2 scores, as well as 2 receptions for 12 receiving yards. That netted you 30.9 fantasy points in full PPR. And I do think with the emergence of Khalil Herbert, there is an opportunity here and a real possibility that we see a little bit more of a split start to emerge between Montgomery and Khalil Herbert. Listen, I think both running backs are incredibly talented, but I think they have to be flexes because, like I said, we could see a real split committee coming for the Bears. Saquon Barkley, on the other hand, is a starter for you week in and week out. At the time I'm recording this, Monday night's football game has still not been played, but I don't think it really matters. You know, we get Saquon Barkley versus Chicago. Dameon Pierce just balled out in week 3 against Chicago. Barkley is going to have a good game. I would imagine even against a stout Dallas defense, he still has a decent game tonight. So if you drafted Barkley, he's in your starting lineup moving into week 4. All right, Titans at Colts. We got 2 running backs involved who a lot of fantasy managers have been panicking over in the first couple of weeks. I told you guys, don't panic about Derrick Henry, and did he reward you in week 3 versus Las Vegas? 25.3 fantasy points, 20 rushing attempts, 85 yards on the ground, a score. And guess what? 6 targets, 5 receptions, 58 receiving yards for Derrick Henry. What is happening? If you own Henry, you just have to continue to roll with him against the Colts in week 4 should be a good, gritty divisional matchup. Jonathan Taylor, on the other hand, still got you double-digit fantasy points against the Kansas City Chiefs in the victory game, right? 12.1 fantasy points, 73 yards on the ground, 5 targets, 3 receptions for 20 receiving yards. Another running back, guys, that if you drafted JT, you just have to continue to roll with him. I think both of these running backs, although their ceilings haven't been necessarily consistent on the year, are absolutely worth starting. You have to roll with Henry. You have to roll with Taylor moving into week 4. All right, Chargers at Texans. Another running back who's been relatively frustrating for fantasy managers on the year is Austin Eckler, but really when you look at what he's done, at least in full PPR, he is still netting new double-digit fantasy points every single week. 11.2 points in week 1, 18.4 in week 2, 13.3 in week 3 versus Jacksonville. He had just 4 rushing attempts for 5 yards, but he made up with it for 8 targets, 8 receptions, 48 receiving yards. So really, Eckler just holds that much more value in full PPR as in comparison to half PPR or standard leagues, where he's probably really hurting you at the moment. He has yet to find the end zone. I think that could definitely change in week 4 versus Houston. Dameon Pierce, on the other hand, the running back for the Houston Texans, finally had his breakout game, so to speak. 16.1 fantasy points against Chicago in week 3. 20 rushing attempts, 80 rushing yards, a score on the ground, added 2 receptions for 21 receiving yards. I like him again against the Chargers in week 4. I think he's a solid RB2 and a really good flex as well, especially in your half PPR and standard leagues. So I like both running backs in this matchup moving into week 4. All right, Browns at Falcons. You're starting Nick Chubb. There's no doubt about it. 15.3 points in week 1. 32.3 in week 2, 17.3 in week 3, 23 rushing attempts, 113 rushing yards, and a score versus Pittsburgh. He is in your starting lineups week in and week out. He is a top 3 running back at the moment, regardless of scoring format. I still think Kareem Hunt is an okay flex, and I mainly like him this week as a flex because I like this matchup versus the Falcons. His ceiling has been kind of capped by Nick Chubb so far on the season. We know he had the big game in week 1 versus Carolina, but then just 9.4 points in week 2, 9.1 points in week 3. But like I said, I do like this matchup against Atlanta in week 4, so I think he's a good enough flex if you don't have better options. Cordell Patty and Cheese, another good flex option in my opinion in week 4 versus the Cleveland Browns. Moving into week 3, guess what? Cordell Patterson was a top 5 fantasy back, and guess what? He had 22.3 points against Seattle in week 3, 17 rushing attempts, 141 rushing yards, and a score, and added 1 reception over 12 receiving yards. Guys, maybe we slept way too much and believed way too much of the potential regression for Cordell Patterson, but he has really been the lead back for the Falcons here in the 2022 fantasy football season. I think we continue to roll with him as a solid flex option moving into week 4. All right, Commanders at the Cowboys. I would flex Antonio Gibson. Listen, a little bit of a disappointing day in week 3, but really he still found the end zone, still had 38 rushing yards, still had a reception. Full PPR still netted you 11 fantasy points after having 20 fantasy points in week 1 and 12.1 in week 2. So I say continue to roll with Gibson against the Cowboys. I know it's a little bit of a stout matchup, but I still think he is a viable flex option. I don't even really mind him as an RB2 option if you need to do so moving into week 4. At the time I'm recording this, like I said earlier, talking about Saquon Barkley, the Cowboys and Giants matchup for Monday Night Football has not yet happened. So I'm going off of speculation in weeks 1 and 2 for the Cowboys running backs. I think they're flex options at best. I am assuming Tony Pollard's going to have the better game out of the 2 here in week 3 as things wrap up, but it's definitely possible that Zeke could make more of an impact. Who knows? I think at the moment, each running back for the Cowboys is capping each other's ceilings. I think Pollard has the upside. Unfortunately, Zeke has just not done it so far on the season. Like I said, that could change tonight. But at the time that I'm recording this, I'm leaving both Cowboys running backs as flex options moving into week 4. All right, Jaguars at Eagles. Guys, guess what? James frickin' Robinson is RB2 in all scoring formats at the running back position. Okay, he is a start on a weekly basis. I don't care who he's going up against. Eagles defense is good. I get it. 19.9 fantasy points in week 1, 15.8 in week 2, 20.6 in week 3 against the Chargers, 100 rushing yards, a score, 3 targets, 3 receptions for 16 receiving yards. James Robinson is absolutely balling. He is in line for a potential comeback player of the year award if he can keep this up. And man, this Jaguars offense is humming. They got something going down there in Jacksonville. I think James Robinson is a must start undoubtedly moving into week 4. ETN on the other hand had a better week 3 in comparison to weeks 1 and 2. He's improved fantasy wise each week, but he still just had 13 rushing attempts, 45 rushing yards, 3 targets, 3 receptions. It did net you 10.5 fantasy points overall in full PPR. So I'm not a crazy fan of ETN. I would rather leave him as a sit moving into week 4 just because the matchup is relatively stout. Miles Sanders on the other hand is a flex option on a weekly basis. He did struggle in week 3, just 5.4 fantasy points after 18.5 in week 1, 11.6 in week 2, but I still think that the Jacksonville Jaguars defense is a defense that he can perform against, and really this Eagles offense is humming as well, right? They look incredible, so I don't mind any pieces of this offense in your weekly lineup. I think Miles Sanders is a perfectly fine flex option moving into week 4. All right, Bills at Ravens. I think Devin Singletary is a decent flex option after he had a monster week 3 versus Miami. 24.1 fantasy points, 9 rushing attempts, 13 rushing yards, but really where he made the bulk of his fantasy value was through the air. 11 targets, 9 receptions, 78 receiving yards, and a score. We saw Zach Moss have 4 rushing attempts, 1 target. We saw James Cook have just 1 rushing attempt and 5 targets, 4 receptions. So overall, Devin Singletary is the running back to roll with on this Bills offense. Like I said, I could see this game getting kind of, out of hand, kind of high scoring overall. I feel like both these defenses are relatively vulnerable at the moment, so I could definitely see a little bit of a shootout emerging between Josh Allen's led offense and Lamar Jackson's led offense. So I like Devin Singletary as a potential flex. I would sit the Ravens running backs though, just far too inconsistent. I told you guys, don't start J.K. Dobbins moving into week 3. He's going to be eased back in. He had 7 rushing attempts, 23 rushing yards, 2 targets, 2 receptions for 17 receiving yards. That netted you just 6 points in full PPR. Justice Hill had 6 rushing attempts for 60 yards on the ground. Mike Davis had 0 rushing attempts. Lamar Jackson, on the other hand, had 11 rushing attempts for 107 rushing yards. A big reason why I'm just not a fan of the Ravens backfield. There's always a chance one of these guys is going to score. I just think it's too much of a risk, and I think it continues to be a risk moving into week 4. All right, Cardinals at the Panthers. I think James Conner is a flex for me. He's been disappointing in weeks 2 and week 3, coming off of the ankle injury after a 15.5 fantasy point day in week 1. So I think he continues to be a flex option. I don't mind him as an RB2 option, but I'm liking Conner a little bit more as a flex option overall at this point in the season. But you guys know he's one of my favorite running backs. I do think he can get back to what we saw last year from a fantasy standpoint. CMC, on the other hand, is sitting at RB10 in full PPR. This offense just really feels like it is capping the potential of Christian McCaffrey, but in full PPR, he still has had double-digit fantasy points every week of the season. In week 3 versus the Saints, 13.5 fantasy points, 108 rushing yards, 4 targets, 2 receptions for 7 receiving yards. Still a huge fan of Christian McCaffrey. He's still a start for me on a weekly basis. All right, Broncos at Raiders. Something about this matchup I'm just not very crazy about. I just, for whatever reason, like any matchup with the Broncos, I'm just not a fan of from a fantasy standpoint. So I think Javonte comes in as a flex. I think Melvin Gordon, who actually had the better fantasy day in week 3, also comes in as a flex with some risk associated. I mean, the Broncos running backs are just absolutely capping each other's ceilings on a weekly basis. Javonte Williams in week 3 had 9 fantasy points on the dot in full PPR, 58 yards on the ground, 5 targets, 3 receptions. He has no touchdowns on the season. Javonte, I needed 1 more point, actually less than a point, to win one of my matchups this week. Shout out to my boy Tyler, who beat me by less than a point. Melvin Gordon, on the other hand, like 14.5 fantasy points, but he had 6.2 points in week 1, 6.3 in week 2. What do we do with this backfield? The offense just does not look good. The coaching does not look good. They're flexes for me and nothing better, and it saddens me because I have Javonte acting as a primary RB2 on one of my teams. But regardless, Josh Jacobs, on the other hand, I think is also no more than a flex at this point in the season. 8.3 points in week 1, 9.1 in week 2, 13.7 in week 3, and 66 yards on the ground. He did have 6 targets, 5 receptions for 31 receiving yards. He was one of the bright spots of this offense, but from a fantasy perspective, he has not scored a touchdown so far on the season. The Raiders have not been what we thought they could be moving in to the 2022 season. They are the only team in the league with 0 wins. They get Denver in week 4. I'm not in love with this game script. I would leave Javonte, Melvin Gordon, and Josh Jacobs all as flexes moving into week 4. All right, the Patriots at Packers. Talk about two backfields that I don't know what in the world to do with. Damian Harris of the New England Patriots had 12.6 fantasy points in week 3, 41 yards on the ground, a score on the ground, 3 targets, 2 receptions. Then on the other hand, Ramondre Stevenson, after having 4.7 fantasy points in week 1, 6.1 in week 2, had 20.1 fantasy points in week 3, 73 yards on the ground, a score, 5 targets, 4 receptions. That is why they are flexes to me, because I just don't know who's going to get it done on a weekly basis. Last week they both looked good. Are they both going to look good versus the Packers in week 4? I'm not sure. Mac Jones is dealing with some injuries at the moment. This offense could be in trouble against a Packers defense that is actually quite good. So I think Harris and Stevenson are flexes at best moving into week 4. Let's move on to the Packers backfield, who is also completely frustrating from a fantasy perspective. Aaron Jones, 4.7 fantasy points in week 3. AJ Dillon, 5.8 fantasy points in week 3. Week 1 for Aaron Jones, 10.6 points. 32 points in week 2 for Aaron Jones. AJ Dillon had 20.1 fantasy points in week 1 and just 7.7 in week 2. So what in the world do we do with the Packers running backs? We know the upside that Aaron Jones brings. We know the talent that AJ Dillon is, and we know that this offense needs some help from the running back position, but I just don't know what to do with the Packers running backs other than have them in the flex and hope that they find the end zone. So moving into week 4, they are both going to be flexes for me. All right, Chiefs at the Buccaneers. Man, Clyde Edwards-Helaire has been an absolute gem of a draft selection moving into the 2022 season. Week 1, 22.4 points. Week 2, 15.8. Week 3, 14.9 fantasy points in full PPR. Listen to this. In week 3, Clyde Edwards-Helaire had 7 rushing attempts and 1 score, but he had 0 yards on the ground. How crazy is that? Yet he had 5 targets, 5 receptions for 39 receiving yards. So that in combination with the touchdown still netted him 14.9 fantasy points in full PPR. It's one of the weirdest stat lines I've ever read out loud on the channel, maybe the weirdest. But nonetheless, moving into week 4 against the Bucs, it's a stout defense, I get it, but I think that CH is a perfectly fine start. He has played well enough on the season that he needs to be in your starting lineups. Leonard Fournette, on the other hand, similar to guys like Alvin Kamara that we've talked about on the day, I think he's downgrading to a flex for me from the RB2 or RB1 position. 12 points in week 3, so it was a better fantasy performance overall. 35 yards on the ground, 35 yards through the air. So his usage is still encouraging enough, but I don't know. I don't feel extremely confident, not necessarily in Leonard Fournette, but really the Buccaneers offense as a whole. Receivers are still hurt. They get Mike Evans back in week 4. It's going to help. The offensive line is bad. Brady is struggling. This team is struggling. So I am a little bit worried about their offensive output, and that is the main reason I have Fournette as a flex, but I don't think he's a bad flex option. I just don't love him in the RB1 or RB2 spot if you have better overall options moving into week 4. All right, Rams at Niners. We got some flex options going on here. Man, Cam Akers found the end zone. Let's go, baby. 12 rushing attempts, 61 rushing yards, and a score. All you Cam Akers owners out there are happy, but also very confused on what to do with Akers. He also had a lost fumble, which hurt his fantasy stat line. Darrell Henderson, after having double-digit fantasy points in full PPR in weeks 1 and 2, had 1.7 fantasy points in week 3. So I told you guys, man, I like Henderson moving into the season. I think he's the better draft value. But at any point in the season, Sean McVay could flip a switch and Akers could be the guy. Who knows? Jake Funk could be the guy for all we know. So Cam Akers is the hot hand at the moment. 15 rushing attempts in week 2, 12 in week 3. I think he's the better overall flex, but I still have some faith in Darrell Henderson. But this is the main issue. This is why both these running backs are flex options, because we just don't quite know what Sean McVay is going to do on a weekly basis and what running back he is going to utilize. We could see a lot of flip-flopping between Hendo and Akers, so they are nothing more than a flex for me moving into week 4. Let's talk about Jeff Wilson Jr., the San Francisco 49ers. At the moment, he is still the lead back for the Niners. Marlon Mack and Jordan Mason completely irrelevant. Jeff Wilson, on the other hand, had 12 rushing attempts, 75 yards on the ground, 3 receptions for 31 receiving yards. He did have a lost fumble in this game, but in full PPR, he netted just over 10.5 fantasy points. He had 12.3 points in week 2. So far as a primary starter for the Niners, he has looked just fine. I think you continue to roll with Wilson as a flex option if you don't have better options. I don't love him as an RB1 or RB2, but if you need to, I'm not completely against it. The Rams defense hasn't been great on the season, so I like Jeff Wilson in the flex. I do think he's a good start moving into week 4. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button down below if you are new to the channel. It really does help out the channel when you guys hit the like button and the subscribe button. We truly appreciate it. And let me know in the comments section down below any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season. Starts, sits, trades, waiver wire, running back, quarterback, receiver, tight end, kickers, defense, whatever it may be. Let me know. I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.